And the misleading attempt by those who oppose military preemption is unfortunately a misleading attempt, or attempt in misleading, which is part and parcel of a package of misleading set of policies. One of them, as Sarah mentioned before, has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation, suggesting that there is an obvious eventuality to an Israeli control of the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, and that eventuality supposedly is the demise of Jewish majority in the area. According to the demography of doom, or the demographers of doom, primarily in Israel but also outside of Israel, Jews are doomed to become a minority for a simple reason, supposedly. Because don't we all know that Arabs are part of the third world, and therefore they have high level of, or high rate of fertility? Don't we know that Jews in Israel are part of the Western world and therefore are burdened by low level of fertility? And therefore, one does not need to be a demographer, or one does not need to study the issue in order to conclude. It's a question of when and not whether there will be an Arab majority between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. But just like most conventional so-called wisdom, this also is completely detached from reality. We're not talking about a new phenomena, by the way. Way back when Theodor Herzl launched his campaign of modern Zionism back at the end of the 19th century, he was confronted by the leading Jewish historian demographers of those days. One of them, Shimon Dubnov, published a demographic projection back in March of 1898. And according to that projection by Shimon Dubnov, the #1 Jewish demographer of those days, by the year 2000, said the notable demographer, there couldn't be more than 500,000 Jews between the river and the Mediterranean. He was off by over 5.5 million Jews. In 1944, all the way through 1948, Ben-Gurion was confronted by the leading statisticians and demographers in Israel, among others the founder of Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, who is, by the way, who was the mentor of today's leading Israeli statisticians and demographer. And that leading statistician demographer tried to convince Ben-Gurion that 600,000 Jews back in 1947 did not constitute a critical mass in order to become a sovereign country, and should Ben-Gurion proceed with that, he should expect very quick transformation into minority, because again, Jewish fertility is low and Arab fertility is high, and therefore he said by the year 2001, this is a projection from October 1944, by the year 2001, said the late Professor Roberto Bacchi, the founder of Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, there will be a minority of 2.3 million Jews, minority of 33%. Well, he was off by roughly 4 million Jews, and the reality is almost 180 different than all those demographic projections. If we go fast forward to 2014, we have on hand right now Jewish fertility rate in Israel, which is higher than any Arab country other than 3, Yemen, Iraq, and Jordan, which are coming down towards West European fertility rate, while the Jewish fertility rate in Israel is still surging as of March, April 2014. Contrary to misperceptions, this surge of Jewish fertility is not because of the ultra-Orthodox high fertility rate. It's in spite of the decline of the ultra-Orthodox fertility rate. It's despite of the slight decline of the modern Orthodox fertility rate in Israel. The surge of Jewish fertility rate in Israel for the first time since 1948 has to do with an explosion of secular demographic indicators. We're talking today not only about the overall secular folks in Israel, but primarily about the yuppies of Tel Aviv, the capital of secularism in Israel, where 15, 20 years ago it was 1 or 2 babies, and the 1 or 2 babies of the Tel Aviv yuppies has been transformed into 3 or 4 babies. This is the bon ton, this has been the bon ton of Jewish mothers in the yuppie areas of Tel Aviv as of the last 15 or so years. We're talking about the 1 million Jews who came from the Soviet Union during the 1990s, and they arrived to Israel with a typical Russian, Ukraine, Moldovan fertility rate of 1 baby per woman. Today, the second and third generation of those who came to Israel during the 1990s from then the USSR already having excess of 2 babies per woman and very rapidly catching up with the average of more than 3 babies, which is the average of Jewish women today in Israel. In fact, when both spouses in Israel both Jewish spouses are Israeli born, then the average number of babies is already 3.4 and trending upward, At the same time, according to the most recent CIA record of January 2014, the World Factbook, the fertility rate of Arab women in Judea and Samaria is 2.83 babies per woman and trending downward. And by the way, trending downward in a very rapid pace, which is compatible with the entire Arab Muslim scene from Mauritania in Northwest Africa all the way to Iran in the Persian Gulf, where we have seen a modernity-driven collapse with a capital C of Muslim fertility. Iran, the most extreme Shiite Muslim country, 1.8 babies per woman, down from roughly 7 per woman during the days of the Shah. Saudi Arabia, the most religious, radical, Sunni, Wahhabi country, 2.3 and trending downwards towards 2. In Egypt, where during the days of President Sadat, his wife Jihan promoted family planning, she was threatened by Muslim Brotherhood who tried to murder her for this heresy of family planning. Today in Egypt, 2.9 and trending downward. Syria, 2.4 babies and trending downward. North Africa, 1.8, 1.9 babies. And again in Israel, 3/3 and 3.4 when both spouses are Israeli born. The question is, what is bringing down the fertility rate of Arabs in Judea and Samaria, which in 2000 was 5 babies per woman, down from 7, 8 only 10 years before, but from 5 babies in 2000 to 2.83 in 2014. This is a pace which is unprecedented in human history. And that unprecedented decline is driven by modernity. For instance, today, every single Arab girl in Judea Samaria, as it is within the pre-67 area of Israel, completes high school. And increasingly larger and larger majority among the graduate of high school enroll in community colleges and universities. As it is, by the way, in Israel, even among the Bedouin women in the Negev in the south, who enroll in Ben Gurion University, in Sapir College, through what we would call affirmative action programs designed specifically for Bedouins to upgrade their standard of living. But the ripple effect is that when women complete high school and enroll in community colleges and universities, they do not get married at the age of 15. And they do not start reproduction at the age of 16. The whole process starts after the age of 20. And there you have consideration of education, and consideration of career, and consideration of vacation, and consideration of cost of living. And the result is, again, from 5 babies in 2000 to 2.8 today, and trending towards 2. That's the story of Arabs in Judea Samaria. That's the story of Arabs in pre-67 Israel. And by the way, in Gaza, the difference is 1 baby. In Gaza, it's less than 4 babies per woman, while in Judea Samaria, it's less than 3. But none of them is anything close to what the Western gullibility or imagination, Lawrence of Arabia style, is promoting through policy and articles. We're talking also in Judea Samaria about family planning. According to recent studies conducted, by the way, by Arabs here in Washington, the Muslim world goes through a family planning revolution. The #1 country leading that effort among Muslims is Morocco. 76% of Moroccan women in the reproductive age use contraceptives trying to avoid bearing babies. The #2 Muslim entity as far as family planning is the Palestinian Authority. 71% of women in the reproductive age use contraceptives trying to minimize on babies. And then you have the issue of emigration. Going back to 1950, where we found, the team which I belong to, where we found documentation of migration, emigration, immigration, documentation by Jordan in Judea Samaria and Egypt in Gaza. Going back to 1950, every year is a year of net emigration. By the way, with an exception, 3 years of Oslo, when a reckless Israeli government was preoccupied with importing some 70,000, 80,000 Palestinian terrorists from camps in Yemen and Iraq and Syria and Sudan and Tunisia and Jordan and Lebanon, etc. Other those 3 years and 3 more years in 1980, when the late King Hussein flexed a muscle, minimized passages through the Jordan River to prove who was in charge. Other than those 6 years, from 1950 until the end of 2013, every year is a year of net emigration. Give you an example. We're talking about 2013, 20,000 net emigration from Judea and Samaria alone. The prior 4 years, anywhere between 16,500 to 18,000 annual net emigration from Judea and Samaria alone. The last documented data from Gaza goes back to 2005. It was collected by the European force which was stationed there and ran away after Israel uprooted 8,000 Jews from Gaza and Hamas took over. The last figure which was documented by the Europeans was 11,000 annually net emigration from Gaza. According to everybody who deals with Gaza, the numbers have quadrupled, 5 times as many, etc., because the border between Gaza and Sinai is relatively open compared to the strangulation imposed by Mubarak there. But again, in Judea and Samaria, 20,000 in 2013. The vast majority of immigrants are young folks. Old people do not tend to emigrate. Among the vast majority who are young, there is a vast majority of a male population, because men tend to emigrate much more than women, who are young women who are not allowed by their parents to take such a dramatic step. And as a result, by the year, the gap between the number of women and the number of men in Judea Samaria is widening, which takes a toll as far as fertility in Judea and Samaria. As a result, is the median wedding age is becoming very, very high, and it means that if in the past fertility or reproductive years were from 15 to 49, today the effective fertility or reproductive age is 20 plus, all the way to roughly 45, which brings it down from very high third world fertility rate to a European fertility rate. And last and not least, we're talking in Judea and Samaria about a very rapid urbanization process. We're talking about 1967, when Israel came into the area, liberating Judea and Samaria, where 70% of the Arabs were rural. Being rural lends itself to multitude of babies. Today, 2014, 75% is urban, which lends itself to less and less children. Those of you who visit Israel may note when you drive on Highway 443 between Jerusalem and Modi'in and Tel Aviv, you see on the northern side the town of Ramallah, and every few months another high-rise, another high-rise. High-rise means less babies. People move from the spacious homes in the nearby villages into the new high-rise, and therefore, and that is one of the many reasons why they produce 2 or 3 rather than 7 or 8 babies. When we shift now to the Jewish side of the formula, one may ask, why wouldn't Jews be also affected in a similar way by modernization? And the reply is very simple. Because Jews are not normative. Very simple. Especially when you are a Jew in Israel. And if Jews would have been normative, if Jews would have been normative, there wouldn't be a Jew left in 2014. How else have Jews survived the different attempts on their survival, if not through non-normative phenomena, development, and display of resistance and determination? And I keep telling the demographers of doom in Israel, as long as they continue applying normative demography to Jews in Israel, they'll keep being wrong and wronger and wrongest, as they have been since the first day of statehood in 1948. When it comes to Jews in Israel, in 1995, there were 80,000 babies, Jewish babies, born then, in 1995. In 2013, there were 132,000 Jewish babies born in Israel. 65% rise. There is no such phenomena anywhere in the world during those years, not in the developed world and not in the third world. So obviously, those are the years of the huge wave of 1 million who came from the former USSR. But that was not a one-time event. Those 1 million have become part and parcel of every year, so-called inventory of new babies. And as I mentioned before, with one difference. The initial wave came with 1 baby per woman. The current byproduct of that wave is producing more than 2 and very close to catch up with the 3, which is the minimal norm of fertility rate among Jews in Israel. When one examines the non-normative aspect of Jewish demography, or basically Jewish state of mind in Israel, and I emphasize in Israel, not other places in the world, one finds out that there is a high level of compatibility between the level of fertility rate on one hand and the level of optimism, patriotism, communal responsibility, and attachment to roots. And when it comes to each one of these elements, patriotism, optimism, communal responsibility, attachment to roots, Jews in Israel are very, very high on each one of those elements, whether they are religious or secular, left or right, conservative or liberal, doves or hawks. A week ago, 2 weeks ago, we celebrated Purim. Secular and religious Jews in Israel celebrated Purim. In a few weeks, we'll celebrate Passover. On the eve of Passover, secular and religious Jews will sit around the table and retell the story of the Exodus. And for a whole week, we're going to have the Passover festival in Israel celebrated by secular and religious. We're talking about, again, Tel Aviv, the center of secularism, some say even hedonism, unfortunately, in Israel. The mayor of Tel Aviv, some of you may know him, Ron Hultai. Ron was just elected to a third term as a mayor, which attests, I believe, to his effectiveness. He is very left. He is very peacenik. He is very liberal. And when it comes to criticizing the people on the right, hawks, religious, he takes no prisoners. It's always under the belt. But it's that mayor which has promoted relentlessly a whole night study session on the eve of Shavuot, the Pentecost holiday. And when he was asked, Ron, what's going on? Are you becoming a born-again Jew? He said, absolutely not. I'm not religious. This is culture. Now, I don't care how do you define one whole night study before Pentecost, culture, religion. It's roots. And when people are concerned about roots and they attach to roots, they want those roots to be cultivated. And there's only one way to ensure cultivation of roots, and that's by producing more and more babies. If you don't produce babies, you're going to lose those roots because nobody will be there to water and fertilize and nourish those roots. We're talking about Israel's economy in recent years. In recent years, as people here probably know, the Israeli economy stands out as definitely, if not the leading economy of the OECD countries, definitely one of the top 3 economies of the OECD countries. We do have our share of problems, but in relative terms, if you look at all the indicators, the GDP, the national debt ratio to GDP, the foreign exchange reserve, the level of inflation, the level of unemployment, the level of exports, the level of of our interest rate, the strength of the local currency, the level of taxes, the ratio of personal and business expenditure to GDP, etc., we stand out as if not the most fiscally responsible economy, definitely one of the most. And obviously, a major reason for that phenomena of 2013, $12 billion overseas investment in Israel has to do with the surge of the Israeli high-tech. And the vast majority of the high-tech folks happen to be secular folks. And in addition of being patriot and optimist and attached to roots and communal responsibility, now there is also the capability. And therefore you see among the high-tech, secular, liberal, cosmopolitan folks, more and more children. Many of them come to the US to conclude joint ventures, initiate new business arrangements. And when they socialize with their counterparts and they talk about families, and when the American hear that they have 3, 4, sometimes 5 children, the immediate quip is, oh, I didn't know that you were religious. Because in the US, how else but being Catholic or evangelical or Mormon if you have more than 2 or 3 children? That's not the case in Israel, because once again, we are not normative, and in a very positive sense, because if we were normative, we would not be around, and the world would not benefit, not from Jews and not from the state of Israel, as it has benefited from our non-normative performance. When it comes to Palestinian numbers, as Sarah mentioned, there's been very problematic aspects there. The problematic aspect stands out in view of the fact that until the team which I represent surfaced back in 2004, no one, and I emphasize no one, not in the US, not in Israel, not in the UN, nowhere, dared, so to speak, scrutinize, audit, conduct due diligence as far as the Palestinian numbers. The numbers were embraced as if they were brought down from Mount Sinai without any due diligence. We have been the first and so far the sole team to undertake auditing of both the Israeli numbers by the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics and the Palestinian number by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics. And our findings are very, very simple. For instance, the Palestinians themselves have suggested time after time, and so it has been reaffirmed by Israeli professors, statisticians who have partaken in their census. They also include in their numbers in excess of 400,000 Palestinians who have been abroad for more than a year. By the way, almost all of them from Judea and Samaria. Now, what does it mean to be more than a year away from your own country? There is an international standard accepted by every single country in the world, other than one entity, the Palestinian Authority. They do not cheat. I emphasize, they do not lie. They simply have a different way of counting. It's as if you decide in Israel, for instance, that from now on, we are not going to include housing in the computation of inflation rate. And overnight, from 6.5% inflation, we are going to see miracle, 3.5% inflation rate. Certainly, you must disclose what has been the change in your methodology. The Palestinians, to their credit, did not lie, have not lied. And in fact, we know about that because we went through their press releases of the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, and that's when we found out. after the first census, which was conducted in 1997, June 1997, we found out that the head of the Central Bureau of Statistics in Ramallah, then a chap named Hassan Abu Libde, who today is a title of Minister in Commerce and Industry, he said in a press conference that they included then in 97 325,000 people who were abroad for over a year. Now, why is there an international standard precluding such a practice? Because according to international standards, Bureau of Statistics do not count only citizens. Bureau of Statistics also count residents. And if you are a professor from the Hebrew U and you go to Yale, and a year and a day goes by, on that day you're added to the count of the state of Connecticut. To avoid a double count, the rule is you are deleted from the count of your mother country. You go back to the mother country and then you will be re-added. By the way, it has no impact on citizenship, on social security, on any rights of the individual. It only precludes a double count. Israel, by the way, is very strict about it. And when you're back as a professor, as a student, as a consultant, as an advisor, as a traveler, or as an immigrant expatriate, you come back, it takes 90 days to be in Israel in order to demonstrate an intent that you are indeed back in the country, and only then you are re-added after you were subtracted during your initial stage of being abroad. Today, those 325,000 have become in excess of 400,000 because that number, by definition, grows. It grows because they do breed babies. They do produce babies, and the number grows constantly. We also found out that the Arabs in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, or in the area beyond the Green Line, all of them bear Israeli ID cards. Around 15,000 are citizens. The vast majority were offered citizenship after '67, but they refused due to pressure by the PLO and other Arab elements, and they remain permanent residents, but not citizens, in any case, bearing Israeli ID cards. Since they bear Israeli ID cards, therefore the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics include them in the count of Israelis as a whole. However, the Palestinians said, hell no, those are West Bankers, and they include them in the count of Arabs in Judea and Samaria. And as a result, 300,000 Arabs who reside in Jerusalem beyond the Green Line are doubly counted. And for any international agency or any researcher to find out how many Arabs are there between the river and the Mediterranean, the obvious way to do that, you call the Israeli Bureau of Statistics, how many Arabs in Israel? And they tell you X number of Arabs, and you call the Palestinians. How many Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza? And they tell you why. You say, well, it's very easy. Between the river and the Mediterranean, there is X plus Y Arabs, and in most cases, you fail to notice that this includes a double count of 300,000. You have then the case of Arabs, mostly from Judea and Samaria, who married Israeli Arabs. Until November 2003, there was an Israeli statute, an amazing statute, which literally provided almost automatic citizenship to any Arab marrying an Israeli Arab. This stopped in November 2003 through reversal or change of that statute, but between the initial Palestinian census of 1997 until November 2003, 105,000 Arabs, mostly from Judea and Samaria, married Israeli Arabs, and on the coattail of their marriage, they became also Israelis. But they did not tear up their Palestinian documentation, and therefore, just like Jerusalem Arabs, so have they been doubly counted. And then there are many other, or few other such discrepancies which we identified. The bottom line is, when it comes to Judea and Samaria Arabs, the actual number as of December 31st, 2013 is 1.7, or I should say almost 1.7 million Arabs, and not 2.7 as the official Palestinian numbers suggest. And again, not because they lie. They do not lie. They simply count differently, unbeknown to American and other policy makers. When it comes to the actual ratio of Jews versus Arabs in the area west of the Jordan River, we have today 6.5 million Jews in Israel. And when I say 6.5 million Jews, I refer to 6.5 million strategic Jews, not rabbinical Jews. Because according to the rabbinate, some 300,000 who came from the former USSR, product of mixed families, Jewish, non-Jewish families, who came to Israel as Jews by the law of return, have not been recognized by the rabbinate as Jews in accordance with the halacha, with the Torah. Now, this is not a strategic matter. This is not a demographic matter. This is an issue of divinity. And unfortunately, sadly, American policymakers, many Israeli policymakers have transformed it into a strategic issue, and therefore they document 6.2 million Jews and 300,000 other people. What do you mean other people? Persians, Australians, New Zealanders. What do you mean other people? By the way, the term other is also very ugly. It's ugly because those of you familiar with Jewish history, that's the way in the old days in Europe, the old rabbis used to refer to Jews who left the religion and fought against Judaism, or so-called misled Judaism. They were the others, in a not negative, but in a most egregious, immoral, negative way. To realize that this is how the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics categorizes 300,000 who came to Israel, partaking in Israeli wars against terrorists, who are murdered by terrorists, who are killed while defending the country in Lebanon or in Gaza. But when it comes to official documentation, they are others. This is utterly immoral. But the bottom line is that we have 6.5 million Jews, side by side with 1.7 million Arabs in pre-67 Israel, and 1.7 million Arabs in Judea and Samaria, which means in the combined area of Judea, Samaria, and pre-67 Israel, which is the practical, relevant context of today. Gaza, as far as I'm concerned, is not today relevant to any such computational discussions. We're talking about a 66% Jewish majority, bearing in mind there is no such thing as constant demography. There is no such thing as linear demography, especially not in our area, due to litany of elements, many of which are uncontrollable, which affect our demographics. The meltdown of the USSR, changed completely the demography. It had nothing to do with Israel or Israel's demographers. Certainly, migration, emigration, immigration are the result of global developments, and therefore we're not talking about linear or constant demography. However, we do talk about trends. The trend of the last 50, 70, and especially the last 20 years has been very, very clear. A very robust Jewish demographic tailwind when it comes to fertility as well as migration. Namely, the 66% is going to grow due to current trends which are very obvious. Modernity-driven, unprecedented decline of Arab demography and unprecedented Jewish tailwind in the area of demography. If in 1995 there were 2.3 Jewish babies born per every Arab baby born, in 2013 there were 3.3 Jewish babies born per every Arab baby born. And that basically means when you take the percentage of currently over 77% of the babies born are Jews, that by fertility alone, the ratio of Jews in Israel is going to be sustained by fertility alone. Bearing in mind that Aliyah, Jewish immigration, has been the force of Israel's rejuvenation, whether it is economically or medically, technologically, militarily, but it has been waves of migration, waves of Aliyah, which have made the difference. Nothing is documented or carved in stone when it comes to waves of Aliyah, but I think that every person who observes objectively the reality in Ukraine and Russia and Germany and France and England and Argentina would conclude that the relative strength of the Israeli economy, the intensified wave of anti-Semitism in those countries, the penetration of Muslims into European countries, and the unprecedented wide base of Jewish Zionist education infrastructure in those countries suggest very, very clear prospect of another huge wave of Aliyah. And when you look back into history, we have experienced cyclical waves of Aliyah every 20 years. During the 1930s, there was a major wave of Aliyah to then pre-statehood land of Israel. During the 1950s, almost 1 million wave of Aliyah came to Israel. During the 1990s, another wave of millions came to Israel. We are now exactly in the midst of that new cycle with a huge window of opportunity. The question obviously is, will the Israeli government, will the Jewish people throughout the world rise to the occasion, or tragically, are we going to miss such a huge opportunity which is being literally at our own doorstep? I would like to end here and turn it now to your opinions, views, questions, statement. Go ahead. And the misleading attempt by those who oppose military preemption is unfortunately a misleading attempt, or attempt in misleading, which is part and parcel of a package of misleading set of policies. One of them, as Sarah mentioned before, has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation, suggesting that there is an obvious eventuality to an Israeli control of the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, and that eventuality supposedly is the demise of Jewish majority in the area. according to the demography of doom, or the demographers of doom primarily. We're not talking about a new phenomena, by the way. Way back when Theodor Herzl launched his campaign of modern Zionism back at the end of the 19th century, he was confronted by the leading Jewish historian demographers of those days. One of them, Shimon Dubnov, published a demographic projection back in March of 1898. And according to that projection by Shimon Dubnov, the #1 Jewish demographer of those days, by the year 2000, said the notable demographer, there couldn't be more than 500,000 Jews between the river and the Mediterranean. He was off by over 5. Jewish fertility is low and Arab fertility is high, and therefore he said by the year 2001, this is a projection from October 1944, by the year 2001, said the late Professor Roberto Bacchi, the founder of Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, there will be a minority of 2.3 million Jews, minority of 33%. Well, he was off by roughly 4 million Jews, and the reality is almost 180 different than all those demographic projections. If we go fast forward to 2014, we have on hand right now Jewish fertility rate in Israel, 1.5 million Jews. In 1944, all the way through 1948, Ben-Gurion was confronted by the leading statisticians and demographers in Israel, among others, the founder of Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, who is, by the way, who was the mentor of today's leading Israeli statisticians and demographer. And that leading statistician demographer tried to convince Ben-Gurion that 600,000 Jews back in 1947 did not constitute a critical mass in order to become a sovereign country, and should Ben-Gurion proceed with that, he should expect very quick transformation into minority, because again, in Israel, but also outside of Israel, Jews are doomed to become a minority. For a simple reason, supposedly. Because don't we all know that Arabs are part of the third world, and therefore they have high level of, or high rate of fertility? Don't we know that Jews in Israel are part of the Western world, and therefore are burdened by low level of fertility? And therefore, one does not need to be a demographer, or one does not need to study the issue in order to conclude. It's a question of when and not whether there will be an Arab majority between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. But just like most conventional so-called wisdom, this also is completely detached from reality.